Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the Dear Forest podcast. Today, we will be tackling a very complex topic once again, EU law. And of course, naturally, we will have a specialist with us today to help us delve into the complexities of this topic. Bert Giersbulk is a professor of commercial law, EU law, and European economic law at KU Leuven. And there were definitely a lot of connections that I saw between what we spoke about last week and our topic this week. So I definitely found it interesting. And yeah, I hope you learn as much as I did once again. Okay, can you tell us your name, where you work, and what you do for work?
Hello, my name is Bert Giersbulk. I'm a full professor at the law faculty of KU Leuven. And I'm also co-director of the Research Institute Consumer Competition Market. I teach commercial law and EU law and European economic law.
All right, I have somebody else here with me today. She will introduce herself now as well.
Hello, I'm Salma Noor. I am a student at the KU Leuven University at the Faculty of Law, and also Professor Bert Giersbulk was my professor for European law, and I also work with Patsimo for the WWF youth team.
Okay, great. Thanks for introducing yourselves both. Let's get into it.
So my first question is, what is the European Union or the EU, and how does it work?
Well, basically the European Union is an international organization, but one of a very special kind. It started back some 70 years ago as a peace project, and still today it is very much a peace project. It started also as a project of economic integration on a regional level, but now it has evolved also to a real political union with a Eurozone, a monetary union that is, and also it has led to a lot of legal integration between the legal systems of the 27 member states. Also, in terms of the topic that we will be discussing today, it's important that you should realize that the EU also aims to contribute to sustainable development. It is explicitly mentioned as one of the objectives of the EU as an international organization.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. So how does EU law work, and in what ways is it different from the national laws of like South Africa, for example?
Mm-hmm. Well, EU law is made at the EU level, and there is a number of EU institutions. You have the European Commission, probably you have heard about that. That is actually a kind of expert committee in which the 27 member states, they each have a commissioner, but that commissioner is not representing the member state. The commissioners, all commissioners, are actually promoting the general interest of the EU as a whole.
And can you maybe explain what is a member state? What qualifies as a member state?
Member states are basically the states that are a member of the club. So Belgium is a member state of the European Union, and there's a number of requirements for any state to be able to become a member state of the EU as such. So the European Commission is an important player if you talk about how is EU law made, because that institution is the only institution that has the right of legislative initiative. So any draft bill is first agreed upon by the College of Commissioners.
Okay, and what is a legislative initiative? I think that was a very legal term.
So we're talking about legislation such as the Deforestation regulation. It is a piece of legislation, and the draft, so the first draft of such a piece of legislation, is always drafted by the European Commission. And then it goes to, I know it's a bit complicated, it is being sent to two other EU institutions. On the one hand, to the European Parliament, representing you and me, EU citizens. There's a direct representation of the EU citizens within the EU Parliament. And on the other hand, it is being sent to the Council of the EU, which is representing the states, the member states. And so in the Council of the EU, you have the competent ministers who also then have to look at that draft bill that was drafted by the European Commission. And the Council and the Parliament are then negotiating together the bill or the piece of legislation.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, the European Parliament is people that you get to vote in if you are a person that lives in the EU.
Yeah.
And then the European Council will be representatives that are then chosen to represent the interests of the country as a whole.
Yeah, the Council, this is composed by ministers, such as, for example, if you talk about the Deforestation regulation, this will have been at one point of time at the table of the Environmental Ministers' Council. Yeah? So it's the 27 ministers for the environment who then come to Brussels, they meet up and they look into the draft bill drafted by the European Commission. Yeah? And they make amendments, just like the European Parliament also makes amendments, and then finally they have to come to compromise text.
Okay, so if something needs to be proposed, then there will be one document that's created, and then it has to go through a couple of changes before there's a final agreement. So it will then go to your minister that represents you, and then also a copy will then go to your representatives that you got to vote for, and then in the end there will be one piece of legislation that will govern whatever it is that there was, say for instance a deforestation law. And so other than being complicated, what exactly makes EU law unique enough to examine separately to international law?
Well, first of all, you have the principle of primacy. Supremacy means that EU law, that's quite similar to international law, it prevails over national law. And we have special proceedings also in the context of the EU, where, for example, the European Commission can also take a member state to court, the court in Luxembourg, the Court of Justice, whenever that member state does not comply with EU law.
So basically European law will kind of is an overarching form of national law.
Precedes, it's the higher norm that prevails over the lower norms, even if these lower norms are national constitutional laws.
Okay. So if something is in the EU, is in EU law, it can then be placed above, say for instance, Belgian law.
Yeah.
So for now, how would you describe the current state of European Union policy on deforestation?
Yeah, I think we are really living very exciting times right now, because we are really in the wake of a revolution, I would say, in terms of the approach of policies and law on deforestation. We are basically facing now a shift from soft law to hard law. Soft law meaning non-binding law, hard law meaning binding black letter law.
And what does binding mean?
Binding, it means that you have to comply with it, that it is not just a hint, but that it is binding legislation, that it is mandatory, that you have to apply.
Consequences?
Yeah, that there's penalties involved if you do not comply. Yeah?
Okay.
So the deforestation regulation is legislation, it's mandatory legislation. We already had at the EU level a timber regulation before, but that applied only to specific products and to wood as such. The deforestation regulation takes a much broader scope. Yeah? And the full title, maybe it's interesting to quote, it's a regulation on making available on the union market and the export from the union of certain commodities and products associated with deforestation and forest degradation. Deforestation and forest degradation. So the new regulation does not just cover wood, like the timber regulation, which by the way is now being repealed. No, it covers cocoa, coffee, cattle, palm oil, rubber, soy and wood, as well as certain derived products, such as, for example, furniture or chocolate or beef. So it has a much broader scope than the pre-existing timber regulation. That is already a first important element. Now, originally, this new regulation would have entered into force in December 2024, but you probably heard in the news that the European Union granted an additional 12-month phasing in period, a transition period. So the law will become applicable on the 30th December 2025 of this year for large and medium companies, and on the 30th June 2026 for micro and small enterprises. So the Commission basically developed a benchmarking system regarding all states on the globe and classified them into 3 deforestation or forest degradation risk categories. You have the low risk states, the standard or the medium risk, and the high risk states. And operators sourcing products entirely coming from areas classified as low risk, they will be subject to simplified due diligence obligations. So cutting red tape, making sure that those operators are subject to less stringent, less strict due diligence obligations.
Okay, so that's also very fair to really focus more on equity instead of equality?
Yeah, I think it's again a compromise and to try to be targeting really the main problems. So the regulation deliberately does not prohibit any type of product or products coming from a particular state. No, it's a very nuanced approach where there is these due diligence obligations imposed on operators who bring products to the market, that they have to show that the products are deforestation free and that they are compliant also with the laws of the member state where the goods come from.
So the biggest development would be that you go from recommendations a bit to very strict law, and also that the EU first regulated small parts of sectors and now we're going to a broader sense of regulations.
Yeah, for example, a coffee producer will have to make a due diligence assessment and it will no longer be possible to sell coffee within the EU if it is sourced from a location outside of the EU that used to be a rainforest until 3 years ago. And so there's an entire system provided by the regulation where basically there is a prohibition to bring products on the market if those products are not deforestation free. Yeah? And you should always be able, as an operator or as a trader, to show that you complied also with the laws of the country of origin, and you have to make a due diligence. So that means that you have to look up all the information, make sure that actually this coffee was not produced in a way that contributed to deforestation or forest degradation.
And show up with receipts as well. So you need the paperwork to prove it.
And risk assessments, risk mitigation strategies, all of this is spelled out in the regulation. I know it's quite technical, but all of this should also be uploaded on a digital platform so as to allow also the enforcers within the member states to check that information. Yeah? And penalties can be imposed on those operators, but they cannot be imposed on the local producers outside of the EU, the small farmers and so on, only on those who bring the products, I would say, on the market in the EU. Those are the ones that are targeted and can be imposed penalties upon.
Yeah, it sounds like a really effective regulation, and it makes the people who profit the most of this deforestation take their responsibility.
Yeah, that's the idea, but still, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, and we'll have to assess after a few years whether this has really been the game changer that we all hope it will be.
I think in the previous episodes that where we spoke a little bit about coffee and cocoa, the regulation came up a lot in conversation, especially the postponement that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been a big fuss about it, and with that specific regulation, how have non-state actors had an influence in the implementation and non-compliance penalties?
Okay, so as to this specific aspect, it's important to stress that basically any legislation that is being adopted at the EU level always involves stakeholder consultations. So NGOs can play a major role. There's public consultations. They can give their input, and all of this input is also to be taken into account by the European Commission when drafting already that first draft of the bill. Yeah? But then also later on, NGOs can give input, just like you and me, individual citizens can do so. Business organizations can also do this, enforcers and so on.
Does the EU, in your opinion, struggle to combine the original economic goals and policies with this new sustainable goals that they would like to achieve?
Yeah, it's of course a big challenge to now switch, I would say, the entirety of European economic law to really take into account the SDGs that were adopted at the UN level. For a long time, over the past 2 decades were really the decades of globalization, and that has important benefits, of course, but also has had some huge drawbacks, also especially environmentally, but also socially. And so now these new pieces of legislation try to, in a way, deal with the shadow side of globalization, which has led to deforestation at an alarming rate.
And just for the listeners that don't know, the SDGs are the Sustainable Development Goals, and they were created by the UN. And I will leave a link in the show notes for you to look at and just look around and figure out what they're about.
Can you explain the role of European law in regulating deforestation, particularly with regard to trade agreements and supply chain management? For example, when the EU wants to combat deforestation, most of the trees that are being cut down, for example, are in the Amazon. So how does that exactly work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. Of course, the EU is taking this issue of deforestation seriously, now with this hard law, binding legislation. And it does so in a variety of ways, not just with this legislation, but also, for example, when it negotiates international trade agreements with other countries. The basic idea behind the new legislation is that, it's most often the expansion of agricultural land, logging trees and then use that new land as agricultural land, that leads to deforestation. That's actually the main driver. And as the EU is a major economy with 450 million quite wealthy consumers who consume a lot of consumables, often also in which wood, cocoa, soy, palm oil, and so on, coffee are part of, the EU is really feels partly responsible also for this deforestation that happens outside of the EU. And as it feels responsible for this problem, it wants to lead the way to solve that problem with this legislation. That is the baseline. And I can say this is just one example, this is just one illustration of this basic approach of the EU. With this deforestation regulation, basically the EU will only allow products within those sectors to the EU market when they comply with the regulation as such. So the EU knows that many third countries look at the EU as a very important export market, a market to which you want to export, because it's a good part of your business plan to also export to the EU. But now the EU is saying, okay, we know this is a fact. We have a leverage, we have a power to help to solve global problems, and deforestation is a global problem, by saying, yes, you can continue to export your goods to the EU, but only upon compliance with our laws. And that is what is sometimes called the Brussels effect. How the EU is setting standards and actually also thereby, in a way, maybe restricting a little bit unfettered globalization, but with a noble goal to contribute to the sustainable development goals.
And maybe to explain globalization briefly, it's just the idea that the world is becoming more and more connected. So you could be sitting in the EU today and you are eating a mango that was grown in like Ecuador like a couple of months ago. And the same thing like with your phone, say for instance, all the minerals that are needed to make your phone are from all over the place, all over the world. And so it's not just in a social media sense, but really the items that we have are also from all over the world. So
so considering the fact that the European Union wants to take a model position in combating problems like deforestation, how effective do you believe that this current legislation or regulations will be or have already been in combating deforestation?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer because the rules are not yet in force. So I think the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. There's still a lot of uncertainty on how all this should be interpreted. So there's plenty of guidance documents, frequently asked question documents that are available on the website of the European Commission. I think it's a first that we really go from soft law to hard law, and that all these important products are now being covered. Ultimately, the effectiveness of this European deforestation regulation remains to be seen in the future, and there will be, of course, monitoring. So, of course, the least that you can then expect is that it really helps in combating or in stopping this trend of deforestation and forest degradation.
What kind of advice would you have for people that are really interested and worried about the climate, but now in recent developments see that the EU is also focusing a lot on defense and other things? Do you still believe that deforestation will be a priority for the European Union, or will it be a bit in the background now?
I think so. Again, a very good question and a topical question. I think, of course, in terms of media coverage, the new efforts in relation to defense are quite clear. And are also very, very important. But as long as these pieces of legislation are not being amended or repealed. I think these are very important pieces of legislation that also will contribute to combating climate change and the loss of biodiversity. Yeah? More is needed. I think for now the focus will also shift a little bit to other new priorities, but that is not to say that all is lost. You see that Green Deal, combating climate change is still high on the agenda. Yeah.
Okay, that is very reassuring to hear. Maybe another question. In a perfect world, how would you change certain EU laws to work better for consumers and planet?
Yeah, again, that's a very difficult question. I think law is always man-made. That means it's a human endeavor to try to come up with rules to change society, to change consumption patterns and production patterns and so on. Whether it is really effective, whether the goal that the legislator has in mind is effectively reached, that is always to be seen and always to be monitored afterwards. So if you ask me, which specific EU laws should be changed, there's plenty of things that are not yet being regulated. So, for example, stimulating models in which you no longer buy products, but in which you rent products, for example. Product as a service system. So we have had a PhD researcher on this particular topic. This might incentivize producers to make products that last much longer. If I no longer own my cell phone, but if I rent it, then that also incentivizes the producer to make sure that the cell phone lasts longer. The same with furniture, which is closely linked, if it is wooden furniture, to this topic. If I would rent, for example, my furniture for outside, instead of having to buy it, maybe that would then also incentivize producers to make long-lasting furniture.
Okay, thank you for that great idea. I think my only qualm with it might be that it seems like we have subscriptions for everything now.
Yeah.
Like the software in your car can also get a subscription. So I think for items it's a great idea, but I'm not so sure I'm keen on the other implications of that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Also made already by lots of scholars that it might lead to consumer over-indebtedness, because we no longer know how many little subscriptions we have. And also, if you own something, this is important, not just maybe from a social perspective, but also from a legal perspective, because if you are an owner, it's a different thing than if you are in a place where everything, all the things surrounding you, are not your ownership. It's a totally different situation from a private law perspective. So every benefit also has a kind of drawback. That's for sure.
Yeah, that's definitely true. So on last week's episode, we discussed international deforestation law very broadly. And so how would you say EU laws on deforestation interact with international agreements such as the Paris Agreement or biodiversity treaties?
Mm-hmm. Up until the first, I would say, 20 years of this millennium, it was still very much business as usual. It was only in the slipstream of the Paris Agreement, 2015, that as from 2019 the EU really stepped in and came up with Green Deal legislation. I think the EU really tries to take all those international commitments seriously. The EU is always referring to those international commitments, to the Paris Agreement on climate change, or to the accompanying Montreal Global Biodiversity framework that was adopted in December 2022 in order to come up with a framework to combat biodiversity loss. These are two related mega trends that we definitely have to combat. Climate change on the one hand, loss of biodiversity on the other hand. And so the deforestation regulation is just one piece of legislation, one piece of the puzzle. It seeks to contribute to the achievement of the goals set out in those two treaties, but it is complemented by a lot of other EU instruments with similar goals. Think about just one example, eco-design. The eco-design regulation is a regulation that will allow for standard setting in terms of the minimum lifespan of cell phones, of televisions, of furniture, of textiles, and so on. So minimum durability, minimum repairability, minimum requirements on recyclability. That's another very important one.
If there is one thing that you hope someone listening would take away from this episode, if nothing else, what would it be?
It would definitely be that I hope that certainly the EU, but also other major players really keep this issue of deforestation, but also climate change generally, and loss of biodiversity, which is also a huge problem, sometimes a little bit in the shadow. Everybody is talking about climate change, but loss of biodiversity is a huge problem as such. It's closely linked. And yeah, I would really hope that this stays high on the agenda. And I think also a main takeaway point is that the EU has this position, this leverage position that I talked about, and that it should be used in a good way to try to be at the forefront in terms of standard setting, and also to convince other regional players that this is the way forward, that we have to have not just a socially corrected market economy, but also an economy that internalizes the externalities, the costs that come with the way we produce goods and consume goods at a massive scale on a globe.
All right, great. Thank you so much for sharing all of that knowledge and for coming on the podcast. And thank you to you, Salma, for joining and for introducing us to today's guest.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.